Chapter 21. Barrier Swept Away. "Anne," said Leslie, breaking abruptly a short silence, "you don't know how good it is to be sitting here with you again, working and talking and being silent together." They were sitting among the blue-eyed grasses on the bank of the brook in Anne's garden. The water sparkled and crooned past them. The birches threw dappled shadows over them. Roses bloomed among the walks. The sun was beginning to be low, and the air was full of woven music. There was one music of the wind in the firs behind the house, and another of the waves on the bar, and still another from the distant bell of the church near which the wee white lady slept. Anne loved that bell, though it brought sorrowful thoughts now. She looked curiously at Leslie, who had thrown down her sewing and spoken with a lack of restraint that was very unusual with her. "On that horrible night when you were so ill," Leslie went on, "I kept thinking that perhaps we'd have no more talks and walks and works together, and I realized just what your friendship had come to mean to me, just what you meant, and just what a hateful little beast I had been." "Leslie, Leslie, I never allow anyone to call my friends names." "It's true. That's exactly what I am, a hateful little beast. There's something I've got to tell you, Anne. I suppose it will make you despise me, but I must confess it. Anne, there have been times this past winter and spring when I have hated you." "I knew it," said Anne calmly. "You knew it?" "Yes, I saw it in your eyes." "And yet you went on liking me and being my friend." "Well, it was only now and then you hated me, Leslie. Between times you loved me, I think." "I certainly did. But that other horrid feeling was always there, spoiling it back in my heart. I kept it down. Sometimes I forgot it, but sometimes it would surge up and take possession of me. I hated you because I envied you. Oh, I was sick with envy of you at times. You had a dear little home and love and happiness and glad dreams, everything I wanted and never had and never could have. Oh, never could have. That was what stung. I wouldn't have envied you if I'd had any hope that life would ever be different for me. But I hadn't, and it didn't seem fair. It made me rebellious, and it hurt me. And so I hated you at times. Oh, I was so ashamed of it. I'm dying of shame now, but I couldn't conquer it. That night, when I was afraid you mightn't live, I thought I was going to be punished for my wickedness. And I loved you so then. Anne, I never had anything to love since my mother died, except Dick's old dog, and it's so dreadful to have nothing to love. Life is so empty, and there's nothing worse than emptiness. And I might have loved you so much, and that horrible thing had spoiled it." Leslie was trembling and growing almost incoherent with the violence of her emotion. "Don't, Leslie," implored Anne. "Oh, don't. I understand. Don't talk of it any more." "I must. When I knew you were going to live, I vowed that I would tell you as soon as you were well, that I wouldn't go on accepting your friendship and companionship without telling you how unworthy I was of it, and I've been so afraid it would turn you against me." "You needn't fear that, Leslie." "Oh, I'm so glad, Anne." Leslie clasped her brown, work-hardened hands tightly together to still their shaking. "But I want to tell you everything now I've begun. You don't remember the first time I saw you, I suppose. It wasn't that night on the shore." "No. It was the night Gilbert and I came home. You were driving your geese down the hill. I should think I do remember it. I thought you were so beautiful. I longed for weeks after to find out who you were." "I knew who you were, although I had never seen either of you before. I had heard of the new doctor and his bride who were coming to live in Miss Russell's little house. I hated you that very moment, Anne." "I felt the resentment in your eyes. Then I doubted. I thought I must be mistaken, because why should it be?" "It was because you looked so happy. Oh, you'll agree with me now that I am a hateful beast, to hate another woman just because she was happy, and when her happiness didn't take anything from me. That was why I never went to see you. I knew quite well I ought to go. Even our simple Four Winds customs demanded that. But I couldn't. I used to watch you from my window. I could see you and your husband strolling about your garden in the evening, or you running down the poplar lane to meet him, and it hurt me. And yet in another way I wanted to go over. I felt that if I were not so miserable I could have liked you and found in you what I've never had in my life, an intimate, real friend of my own age. And then you remember that night at the shore. You were afraid I would think you crazy. You must have thought I was." "No, but I couldn't understand you, Leslie. One moment you drew me to you, the next you pushed me back." "I was very unhappy that evening. I'd had a hard day. Dick had been very, very hard to manage that day. Generally he is quite good-natured and easily controlled, you know, Anne. But some days he is very different. I was so heartsick I ran away to the shore as soon as he went to sleep. It was my only refuge. I sat there thinking of how my poor father had ended his life and wondering if I wouldn't be driven to it some day. Oh, my heart was full of black thoughts. And then you came dancing along the cove like a glad, light-hearted child. I hated you more then than I've ever done since, and yet I craved your friendship. The one feeling swayed me one moment, the other feeling the next. When I got home that night I cried for shame of what you must think of me. But it's always been just the same when I came over here. Sometimes I'd be happy and enjoy my visit, and at other times that hideous feeling would mar it all. There were times when everything about you and your house hurt me. You had so many dear little things I couldn't have. Do you know, it's ridiculous, but I had an especial spite at those china dogs of yours. There were times when I wanted to catch up Gog and Magog and bang their pert black noses together. Oh, you smile, Anne, but it was never funny to me. I would come here and see you and Gilbert with your books and your flowers and your household goods and your little family jokes and your love for each other showing in every look and word, even when you didn't know it. And I would go home to— you know what I went home to. Oh, Anne, I don't believe I'm jealous and envious by nature. When I was a girl I lacked many things my schoolmates had, but I never cared. I never disliked them for it. But I seem to have grown so hateful. Leslie, dearest, stop blaming yourself. You are not hateful or jealous or envious. The life you have to live has warped you a little, perhaps, but it would have ruined a nature less fine and noble than yours. I'm letting you tell me all this because I believe it's better for you to talk it out and rid your soul of it. But don't blame yourself any more. Well, I won't. I just wanted you to know me as I am. That time you told me of your darling hope for the spring was the worst of all, Anne. I shall never forgive myself for the way I behaved then. I repented it with tears, and I did put many a tender and loving thought of you into the little dress I made. But I might have known that anything I made could only be a shroud in the end. Now, Leslie, that is bitter and morbid. Put such thoughts away. I was so glad when you brought the little dress. And since I had to lose little Joyce, I like to think that the dress she wore was the one you made for her when you let yourself love me. Anne, do you know, I believe I shall always love you after this. I don't think I'll ever feel that dreadful way about you again. Talking it all out seems to have done away with it somehow. It's very strange, and I thought it so real and bitter. It's like opening the door of a dark room to show some hideous creature you've believed to be there, and when the light streams in, your monster turns out to have been just a shadow, vanishing when the light comes. It will never come between us again. No. We are real friends now, Leslie, and I'm very glad. I hope you won't misunderstand me if I say something else. Anne, I was grieved to the core of my heart when you lost your baby, and if I could have saved her for you by cutting off one of my hands, I would have done it. But your sorrow has brought us closer together. Your perfect happiness isn't a barrier any longer. Oh, don't misunderstand, dearest. I'm not glad that your happiness isn't perfect any longer. I can say that sincerely. But since it isn't, there isn't such a gulf between us. I do understand that too, Leslie. Now we'll just shut up the past and forget what was unpleasant in it. It's all going to be different. We're both of the race of Joseph now. I think you've been wonderful, wonderful. And Leslie, I can't help believing that life has something good and beautiful for you yet. Leslie shook her head. No, she said dully. There isn't any hope. Dick will never be better. And even if his memory were to come back, oh, Anne, it would be worse, even worse than it is now. It is something you can't understand, you happy bride. Anne, did Miss Cornelia ever tell you how I came to marry Dick? Yes. I'm glad. I wanted you to know, but I couldn't bring myself to talk of it if you hadn't known. Anne, it seems to me that ever since I was 12 years old, life has been bitter. Before that, I had a happy childhood. We were very poor, but we didn't mind. Father was so splendid, so clever and loving and sympathetic. We were chums as far back as I can remember. And Mother was so sweet. She was very, very beautiful. I look like her, but I'm not so beautiful as she was. Miss Cornelia says you are far more beautiful. She's mistaken, or prejudiced. I think my figure is better. Mother was slight and bent by hard work, but she had the face of an angel. I used to just look up at her and worship. We all worshipped her, Father and Kenneth and I. Anne remembered that Miss Cornelia had given her a very different impression of Leslie's mother. But had not love the truer vision? Still, it was selfish of Rose West to make her daughter marry Dick Moore. "Kenneth was my brother," went on Leslie. "Oh, I can't tell you how I loved him. And he was cruelly killed. Do you know how?" "Yes." "Anne, I saw his little face as the wheel went over him. He fell on his back. Anne, I can see it now. I shall always see it. Anne, all I ask of heaven is that that recollection shall be blotted out of my memory. Oh, my God." "Leslie, don't speak of it. I know the story. Don't go into details that only harrow your soul up unavailingly. It will be blotted out." After a moment's struggle, Leslie regained a measure of self-control. "Then my father's health got worse and he grew despondent. His mind became unbalanced. You've heard all that, too." "Yes." "After that I just had Mother to live for. But I was very ambitious. I meant to teach and earn my way through college. I meant to climb to the very top. Oh, I won't talk of that either. It's no use. You know what happened. I couldn't see my dear little heartbroken mother, who had been such a slave all her life, turned out of her home. Of course I could have earned enough for us to live on, but Mother couldn't leave her home. She had come there as a bride, and she had loved my father so, and all her memories were there. Even yet, Anne, when I think that I made her last year happy, I'm not sorry for what I did. As for Dick, I didn't hate him when I married him. I just felt for him the indifferent, friendly feeling I had for most of my schoolmates. I knew he drank some, but I had never heard the story of the girl down at the fishing cove. If I had, I couldn't have married him, even for Mother's sake. Afterwards, I did hate him, but Mother never knew. She died, and then I was alone. I was only 17 and I was alone. Dick had gone off in the Four Sisters. I hoped he wouldn't be home very much more. The sea had always been in his blood. I had no other hope. Well, Captain Jim brought him home, as you know, and that's all there is to say. You know me now, Anne, the worst of me. The barriers are all down. And you still want to be my friend?" Anne looked up through the birches at the white paper lantern of a half-moon drifting downwards to the gulf of sunset. Her face was very sweet. "I am your friend, and you are mine, for always," she said. "Such a friend as I never had before. I have had many dear and beloved friends, but there is a something in you, Leslie, that I never found in anyone else. You have more to offer me in that rich nature of yours, and I have more to give you than I had in my careless girlhood. We are both women, and friends forever." They clasped hands and smiled at each other through the tears that filled the gray eyes and the blue. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22. Miss Cornelia arranges matters. Gilbert insisted that Susan should be kept on at the little house for the summer. Anne protested at first. "Life here with just the two of us is so sweet, Gilbert. It spoils it a little to have anyone else. Susan is a dear soul, but she's an outsider. It won't hurt me to do the work here." "You must take your doctor's advice," said Gilbert. "There's an old proverb to the effect that shoemakers' wives go barefoot and doctors' wives die young. I don't mean that it shall be true in my household. You will keep Susan until the old spring comes back into your step and those little hollows on your cheeks fill out. You just take it easy, Mrs. Doctor, dear," said Susan, coming abruptly in. "Have a good time and do not worry about the pantry. Susan is at the helm. There is no use in keeping a dog and doing your own barking. I am going to take your breakfast up to you every morning." "Indeed you are not," laughed Anne. "I agree with Miss Cornelia that it's a scandal for a woman who isn't sick to eat her breakfast in bed, and almost justifies the men in any enormities." "Oh, Cornelia," said Susan with ineffable contempt, "I think you have better sense, Mrs. Doctor, dear, than to heed what Cornelia Bryant says. I cannot see why she must always be running down the men, even if she is an old maid. I am an old maid, but you never hear me abusing the men. I like 'em. I would have married one if I could. Is it not funny nobody ever asked me to marry him, Mrs. Doctor dear? I am no beauty, but I am as good-looking as most of the married women you see. But I never had a beau. What do you suppose is the reason?" "It may be predestination," suggested Anne with unearthly solemnity. Susan nodded. "That is what I have often thought, Mrs. Doctor dear, and a great comfort it is. I do not mind nobody wanting me if the Almighty decreed it so for his own wise purposes. But sometimes doubt creeps in, Mrs. Doctor dear, and I wonder if maybe the old scratch has not more to do with it than anyone else. I cannot feel resigned then. But maybe," added Susan, brightening up, "I will have a chance to get married yet. I often and often think of the old verse my aunt used to repeat. 'There never was a goose so gray, but sometime soon or late some honest gander came her way and took her for his mate.' A woman cannot ever be sure of not being married till she is buried, Mrs. Doctor dear, and meanwhile I will make a batch of cherry pies. I notice the doctor favors them, and I do like cooking for a man who appreciates his victuals." Miss Cornelia dropped in that afternoon puffing a little. "I don't mind the world or the devil much, but the flesh does rather bother me," she admitted. "You always look as cool as a cucumber, Anne dearie. Do I smell cherry pie? If I do, ask me to stay to tea. Haven't tasted a cherry pie this summer. My cherries have all been stolen by those scamps of Gilman boys from the Glen." Now, Cornelia," remonstrated Captain Jim, who had been reading a sea novel in a corner of the living room. "You shouldn't say that about those two poor motherless Gilman boys unless you've got certain proof. Just because their father ain't none too honest isn't any reason for calling them thieves. It's more likely it's been the robins took your cherries. They're terrible thick this year." "Robins," said Miss Cornelia disdainfully. "Humph! Two-legged robins, believe me." "Well, most of the Four Winds robins are constructed on that principle," said Captain Jim gravely. Miss Cornelia stared at him for a moment. Then she leaned back in her rocker and laughed long and ungrudgingly. "Well, you have got one on me at last, Jim Boyd, I'll admit. Just look how pleased he is, Anne dearie, grinning like a chessy cat. As for the robin's legs, if robins have great, big, bare, sunburned legs with ragged trousers hanging on 'em, such as I saw up in my cherry tree one morning at sunrise last week, I'll beg the Gilman boys' pardon. By the time I got down they were gone. I couldn't understand how they had disappeared so quick, but Captain Jim has enlightened me. They flew away, of course." Captain Jim laughed and went away, regretfully declining an invitation to stay to supper and partake of cherry pie. "I'm on my way to see Leslie and ask her if she'll take a boarder," Miss Cornelia resumed. "I'd a letter yesterday from a Mrs. Daly in Toronto, who boarded a spell with me 2 years ago. She wanted me to take a friend of hers for the summer. His name is Owen Ford, and he's a newspaper man, and it seems he's a grandson of the schoolmaster who built this house. John Selwyn's oldest daughter married an Ontario man named Ford, and this is her son. He wants to see the old place his grandparents lived in. He had a bad spell of typhoid in the spring and hasn't got rightly over it, so his doctor has ordered him to the sea. He doesn't want to go to the hotel. He just wants a quiet home place. I can't take him, for I have to be away in August. I've been appointed a delegate to the WFMS convention in Kingsport, and I'm going. I don't know whether Leslie'll want to be bothered with him either, but there's no one else. If she can't take him, he'll have to go over the harbor." "When you've seen her, come back and help us eat our cherry pies," said Anne. "Bring Leslie and Dick, too, if they can come. And so you're going to Kingsport. What a nice time you will have. I must give you a letter to a friend of mine there, Mrs. Jonas Blake." "I've prevailed on Mrs. Thomas Holt to go with me," said Miss Cornelia complacently. "It's time she had a little holiday, believe me. She has just about worked herself to death. Tom Holt can crochet beautifully, but he can't make a living for his family. He never seems to be able to get up early enough to do any work, but I notice he can always get up early enough to go fishing. Isn't that like a man?" Anne smiled. She had learned to discount largely Miss Cornelia's opinions of the Four Winds men. Otherwise she must have believed them the most hopeless assortment of reprobates and ne'er-do-wells in the world, with veritable slaves and martyrs for wives. This particular Tom Holt, for example, she knew to be a kind husband, a much-loved father, and an excellent neighbor. If he were rather inclined to be lazy, liking better the fishing he had been born for than the farming he had not, and if he had a harmless eccentricity for doing fancy work, nobody save Miss Cornelia seemed to hold it against him. His wife was a hustler who gloried in hustling. His family got a comfortable living off the farm, and his strapping sons and daughters, inheriting their mother's energy, were all in a fair way to do well in the world. There was not a happier household in Glen St. Mary than the Holts. Miss Cornelia returned satisfied from the house up the brook. "Leslie's going to take him," she announced. "She jumped at the chance. She wants to make a little money to shingle the roof of her house this fall, and she didn't know how she was going to manage it. I expect Captain Jim will be more than interested when he hears that a grandson of the Selwyns is coming here. Leslie said to tell you she hankered after cherry pie, but she couldn't come to tea because she has to go and hunt up her turkeys. They've strayed away. But she said if there was a piece left for you to put it in the pantry, and she'd run over in the cat's light when prowling's in order to get it. You don't know, Anne dearie, what good it did my heart to hear Leslie send you a message like that, laughing like she used to long ago. There's a great change come over her lately. She laughs and jokes like a girl, and from her talk I gather she's here real often." "Every day, or else I'm over there," said Anne. "I don't know what I'd do without Leslie, especially just now when Gilbert is so busy. He's hardly ever home except for a few hours in the wee smalls. He's really working himself to death. So many of the over-harbor people send for him now." "They might better be content with their own doctor," said Miss Cornelia. "Though, to be sure, I can't blame them, for he's a Methodist. Ever since Dr. Blythe brought Mrs. Allonby round, folks think he can raise the dead. I believe Dr. Dave is a mite jealous, just like a man. He thinks Dr. Blythe has too many new-fangled notions. Well, I says to him, it was a new-fangled notion saved Rhoda Allonby. If you'd been attending her, she'd have died, and had a tombstone saying it had pleased God to take her away. Oh, I do like to speak my mind to Dr. Dave. He's bossed the Glen for years, and he thinks he's forgotten more than other people ever knew. Speaking of doctors, I wish Dr. Blythe had run over and see that boil on Dick Moore's neck. It's getting past Leslie's skill. I'm sure I don't know what Dick Moore wants to start in having boils for, as if he wasn't enough trouble without that." "Do you know, Dick has taken quite a fancy to me," said Anne. "He follows me around like a dog and smiles like a pleased child when I notice him." "Does it make you creepy?" "Not at all. I rather like Dick Moore. He seems so pitiful and appealing somehow." "You wouldn't think him very appealing if you'd seen him on his cantankerous days, believe me. But I'm glad you don't mind him. It's all the nicer for Leslie. She'll have more to do when her boarder comes. I hope he'll be a decent creature. You'll probably like him. He's a writer." "I wonder why people so commonly suppose that if two individuals are both writers they must therefore be hugely congenial," said Anne rather scornfully. "Nobody would expect two blacksmiths to be violently attracted toward each other merely because they were both blacksmiths." Nevertheless, she looked forward to the advent of Owen Ford with a pleasant sense of expectation. If he were young and likable, he might prove a very pleasant addition to society in Four Winds. The latch string of the little house was always out for the race of Joseph. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. Owen Ford Comes. One evening Miss Cornelia telephoned down to Anne. "The writer man has just arrived here. I'm going to drive him down to your place, and you can show him the way over to Leslie's. It's shorter than driving round by the other road, and I'm in a mortal hurry. The Reese baby has gone and fallen into a pail of hot water at the Glen and got nearly scalded to death, and they want me right off, to put a new skin on the child, I presume. Mrs. Reese is always so careless, and then expects other people to mend her mistakes. You won't mind, will you, dearie? His trunk can go down tomorrow." "Very well," said Anne. "What is he like, Miss Cornelia?" "You'll see what he's like outside when I take him down. As for what he's like inside, only the Lord who made him knows that. I'm not going to say another word, for every receiver in the Glen is down." "Miss Cornelia evidently can't find much fault with Mr. Ford's looks, or she would find it in spite of the receivers," said Anne. "I conclude, therefore, Susan, that Mr. Ford is rather handsome than otherwise." "Well, Mrs. Doctor, dear, I do enjoy seeing a well-looking man," said Susan candidly. "Had I not better get up a snack for him? There is a strawberry pie that would melt in your mouth." "No, Leslie is expecting him and has his supper ready. Besides, I want that strawberry pie for my own poor man. He won't be home till late, so leave the pie and a glass of milk out for him, Susan." "That I will, Mrs. Doctor, dear. Susan is at the helm. After all, it is better to give pie to your own man than to strangers, who may be only seeking to devour, and the doctor himself is as well-looking a man as you often come across." When Owen Ford came, Anne secretly admitted, as Miss Cornelia towed him in, that he was very well-looking indeed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with thick brown hair, finely cut nose and chin, large and brilliant dark gray eyes. "And did you notice his ears and teeth, Mrs. Dr. dear?" queried Susan later on. "He has got the nicest shaped ears I ever saw on a man's head. I am choice about ears. When I was young I was scared that I might have to marry a man with ears like flaps. But I need not have worried, for never a chance did I have with any kind of ears." Anne had not noticed Owen Ford's ears, but she did see his teeth as his lips parted over them in a frank and friendly smile. Unsmiling, his face was rather sad and absent in expression, not unlike the melancholy, inscrutable hero of Anne's own early dreams, but mirth and humor and charm lighted it up when he smiled. Certainly, on the outside, as Miss Cornelia said, Owen Ford was a very presentable fellow. "You cannot realize how delighted I am to be here, Mrs. Blythe," he said, looking around him with eager, interested eyes. "I have an odd feeling of coming home. My mother was born and spent her childhood here, you know. She used to talk a great deal to me of her old home. I know the geography of it as well as of the one I lived in, and of course she told me the story of the building of the house, and of my grandfather's agonized watch for the Royal William. I had thought that so old a house must have vanished years ago, or I should have come to see it before this." "Old houses don't vanish easily on this enchanted coast," smiled Anne. "This is a land where all things always seem the same. Nearly always, at least. John Selwyn's house hasn't even been much changed, and outside the rose bushes your grandfather planted for his bride are blooming this very minute." "How the thought links me with them! With your leave, I must explore the whole place soon." "Our latch string will always be out for you," promised Anne. "And do you know that the old sea captain who keeps the Four Winds Light knew John Selwyn and his bride well in his boyhood? He told me their story the night I came here, the third bride of the old house." "Can it be possible? This is a discovery. I must hunt him up." "It won't be difficult. We're all cronies of Captain Jim. He will be as eager to see you as you could be to see him. Your grandmother shines like a star in his memory. But I think Mrs. Moore is expecting you. I'll show you our Crosslots road." Anne walked with him to the house up the brook, over a field that was as white as snow with daisies. A boatload of people were singing far across the harbor. The sound drifted over the water like faint, unearthly music, wind-blown across a starlit sea. The big light flashed and beaconed. Owen Ford looked around him with satisfaction. "And so this is Four Winds," he said. "I wasn't prepared to find it quite so beautiful, in spite of all Mother's praises. What colors! What scenery! What charm! I shall get as strong as a horse in no time. And if inspiration comes from beauty, I should certainly be able to begin my great Canadian novel here." "You haven't begun it yet?" asked Anne. "Alackaday, no. I've never been able to get the right central idea for it. It lurks beyond me. It allures and beckons and recedes. I almost grasp it, and it is gone. Perhaps amid this peace and loveliness I shall be able to capture it. Miss Bryant tells me that you write." "Oh, I do little things for children. I haven't done much since I was married. And I have no designs on a great Canadian novel," laughed Anne. "That is quite beyond me." Owen Ford laughed too. "I dare say it is beyond me as well. All the same, I mean to have a try at it some day, if I can ever get the time. A newspaper man doesn't have much chance for that sort of thing. I've done a good deal of short story writing for the magazines, but I've never had the leisure that seems to be necessary for the writing of a book. With 3 months of liberty, I ought to make a start, though. If I could only get the necessary motif for it, the soul of the book." An idea whisked through Anne's brain with a suddenness that made her jump. But she did not utter it, for they had reached the Moore house. As they entered the yard, Leslie came out on the veranda from the side door, peering through the gloom for some sign of her expected guest. She stood just where the warm yellow light flooded her from the open door. She wore a plain dress of cheap, cream-tinted cotton voile, with the usual girdle of crimson. Leslie was never without her touch of crimson. She had told Anne that she never felt satisfied without a gleam of red somewhere about her, if it were only a flower. To Anne, it always seemed to symbolize Leslie's glowing, pent-up personality, denied all expression save in that flaming glint. Leslie's dress was cut a little away at the neck and had short sleeves. Her arms gleamed like ivory-tinted marble. Every exquisite curve of her form was outlined in soft darkness against the light. Her hair shone in it like flame. Beyond her was a purple sky flowering with stars over the harbor. Anne heard her companion give a gasp. Even in the dusk she could see the amazement and admiration on his face. "Who is that beautiful creature?" he asked. "That is Mrs. Moore," said Anne. "She's very lovely, isn't she?" I never saw anything like her," he answered rather dazedly. "I wasn't prepared. I didn't expect— Good heavens, one doesn't expect a goddess for a landlady. Why, if she were clothed in a gown of sea purple with a rope of amethysts in her hair, she would be a veritable sea queen. And she takes in boarders." "Even goddesses must live," said Anne. "And Leslie isn't a goddess. She's just a very beautiful woman, as human as the rest of us. Did Miss Bryant tell you about Mr. Moore?" "Yes, he's mentally deficient or something of the sort, isn't he? But she said nothing about Mrs. Moore, and I supposed she'd be the usual hustling country housewife who takes in boarders to earn an honest penny." "Well, that's just what Leslie is doing," said Anne crisply, "and it isn't altogether pleasant for her either. I hope you won't mind, Dick. If you do, please don't let Leslie see it. It would hurt her horribly. He's just a big baby, and sometimes a rather annoying one." "Oh, I won't mind him. I don't suppose I'll be much in the house anyhow, except for meals. But what a shame it all is. Her life must be a hard one." "It is, but she doesn't like to be pitied." Leslie had gone back into the house and now met them at the front door. She greeted Owen Ford with cold civility and told him in a businesslike tone that his room and his supper were ready for him. Dick, with a pleased grin, shambled upstairs with the valise, and Owen Ford was installed as an inmate of the old house among the willows. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. The Life Book of Captain Jim. "I have a little brown cocoon of an idea that may possibly expand into a magnificent moth of fulfillment," Anne told Gilbert when she reached home. He had returned earlier than she had expected and was enjoying Susan's cherry pie. Susan herself hovered in the background, like a rather grim but beneficent guardian spirit, and found as much pleasure in watching Gilbert eat pie as he did in eating it. "What is your idea?" he asked. "I shan't tell you just yet, not till I see if I can bring the thing about." "What sort of a chap is Ford?" "Oh, very nice, and quite good looking." "Such beautiful ears, Doctor dear," interjected Susan with a relish. "He is about 30 or 35, I think, and he meditates writing a novel. His voice is pleasant, and his smile delightful, and he knows how to dress. He looks as if life hadn't been altogether easy for him, somehow." Owen came over the next evening with a note to Anne from Leslie. They spent the sunset time in the garden, and then went for a moonlit sail on the harbor in the little boat Gilbert had set up for summer outings. They liked Owen immensely, and had that feeling of having known him for many years which distinguishes the Freemasonry of the house of Joseph. "He is as nice as his ears, Mrs. Doctor dear," said Susan when he had gone. He had told Susan that he had never tasted anything like her strawberry shortcake, and Susan's susceptible heart was his forever. "He has got a way with him," she reflected as she cleared up the relics of the supper. "It is real queer he is not married, for a man like that could have anybody for the asking. Well, maybe he is like me and has not met the right one yet." Susan really grew quite romantic in her musings as she washed the supper dishes. 2 nights later, Anne took Owen Ford down to Four Winds Point to introduce him to Captain Jim. The clover fields along the harbor shore were whitening in the western wind, and Captain Jim had one of his finest sunsets on exhibition. He himself had just returned from a trip over the harbor. "I had to go over and tell Henry Pollock he was dying. Everybody else was afraid to tell him. They expected he'd take on terrible, for he's been dreadful determined to live, and been making no end of plans for the fall. His wife thought he ought to be told, and that I'd be the best one to break it to him that he couldn't get better. Henry and me are old cronies. We sailed in the Gray Gulf for years together. Well, I went over and sat down by Henry's bed, and I says to him, says I, just right out plain and simple, for if a thing's got to be told, it may as well be told first as last. Says I, 'Mate, I reckon you've got your sailing orders this time.' I was sort of quaking inside, for it's an awful thing to have to tell a man who ain't any idea he's dying that he is. But lo and behold, Mistress Blythe, Henry looks up at me with those bright old black eyes of his in his wizened face and says he, 'Tell me something I don't know, Jim Boyd, if you want to give me information. I've known that for a week.' I was too astonished to speak, and Henry he chuckled. To see you coming in here,' says he, 'with your face as solemn as a tombstone, and sitting down there with your hands clasped over your stomach, and passing me out a blue mouldy old item of news like that. It'd make a cat laugh, Jim Boyd,' says he. 'Who told you?' says I, stupid like. 'Nobody,' says he. 'A week ago Tuesday night I was lying here awake, and I just knew. I'd suspicioned it before, but then I knew. I've been keeping up for the wife's sake, and I'd like to have got that barn built, for Eben'll never get it right. But anyhow, now that you've eased your mind, Jim, put on a smile and tell me something interesting.' Well, there it was. They'd been so scared to tell him, and he knew it all the time. Strange how nature looks out for us, ain't it, and lets us know what we should know when the time comes. Did I never tell you the yarn about Henry getting the fishhook in his nose, Mistress Blythe?" "No." "Well, him and me had a laugh over it today. It happened nigh on to 30 years ago. Him and me and several more was out mackerel fishing one day. It was a great day. Never saw such a school of mackerel in the Gulf. And in the general excitement Henry got quite wild and contrived to stick a fishhook clean through one side of his nose. Well, there he was. There was barb on one end and a big piece of lead on the other, so it couldn't be pulled out. We wanted to take him ashore at once, but Henry was game. He said he'd be jiggered if he'd leave a school like that for anything short of lockjaw. Then he kept fishing away, hauling in hand over fist and groaning between times. Finally the school passed and we come in with a load. I got a file and began to try to file through that hook. I tried to be as easy as I could, but you should have heard Henry. No, you shouldn't either. It was well no ladies were around. Henry wasn't a swearing man, but he'd heard some few matters of that sort along the shore in his time, and he fished 'em all out of his recollection and hurled 'em at me. Finally he declared he couldn't stand it, and I had no bowels of compassion. So we hitched up and I drove him to a doctor in Charlottetown, 35 miles. There weren't none nearer in them days, with that blessed hook still hanging from his nose. When we got there, old Dr. Crabb just took a file and filed that hook just the same as I'd tried to do, only he weren't a mite particular about doing it easy." Captain Jim's visit to his old friend had revived many recollections, and he was now in the full tide of reminiscences. "Henry was asking me today if I remembered the time old Father Chiniquy blessed Alexander McAllister's boat. Another odd yarn, and true as gospel. I was in the boat myself. We went out, him and me, in Alexander McAllister's boat one morning at sunrise. Besides, there was a French boy in the boat, Catholic, of course. You know old Father Chiniquy had turned Protestant, so the Catholics hadn't much use for him. Well, we sat out in the Gulf in the broiling sun till noon, and not a bite did we get. When we went ashore, old Father Chiniquy had to go, so he said in that polite way of his, 'I'm very sorry I cannot go out with you this afternoon, Mr. McAllister, but I leave you my blessing. You will catch 1,000 this afternoon.' Well, we did not catch 1,000, but we caught exactly 999, the biggest catch for a small boat in the whole North Shore that summer. Curious, wasn't it? Alexander McAllister, he says to Andrew Peters, 'Well, and what do you think of Father Chiniquy now?' 'Vell,' growled Andrew, 'I tink the old devil has got a blessing left yet.' Laws, how Henry did laugh over that today." "Do you know who Mr. Ford is, Captain Jim?" asked Anne, seeing that Captain Jim's fountain of reminiscence had run out for the present. "I want you to guess." Captain Jim shook his head. "I never was any hand at guessing, Mistress Blythe. And yet somehow when he come in I thought, where have I seen them eyes before? For I have seen 'em." "Think of a September morning many years ago," said Anne softly. "Think of a ship sailing up the harbor, a ship long waited for and despaired of. Think of the day the Royal William came in and the first look you had at the schoolmaster's bride." Captain Jim sprang up. "They're Persis Selwyn's eyes," he almost shouted. "You can't be her son. You must be her—" "Grandson, yes. I'm Alice Selwyn's son." Captain Jim swooped down on Owen Ford and shook his hand over again. "Alice Selwyn's son. Lord, but you're welcome. Many's the time I've wondered where the descendants of the schoolmaster were living. I knew there was none on the island. Alice, the first baby ever born in that little house. No baby ever brought more joy. I've dandled her 100 times. It was from my knee she took her first steps alone. Can't I see her mother's face watching her? And it was near 60 years ago. Is she living yet?" "No, she died when I was only a boy." "Oh, it doesn't seem right that I should be living to hear that," sighed Captain Jim. "But I'm heart glad to see you. It's brought back my youth for a little while. You don't know yet what a boon that is. Mistress Blythe here has the trick. She does it quite often for me." Captain Jim was still more excited when he discovered that Owen Ford was what he called a real writing man. He gazed at him as at a superior being. Captain Jim knew that Anne wrote, but he had never taken that fact very seriously. Captain Jim thought women were delightful creatures who ought to have the vote and everything else they wanted, bless their hearts, but he did not believe they could write. "Just look at a mad love," he would protest. "A woman wrote that, and just look at it. 103 chapters, when it could all have been told in 10. A writing woman never knows when to stop, that's the trouble. The pint of good writing is to know when to stop." "Mr. Ford wants to hear some of your stories, Captain Jim," said Anne. "Tell him the one about the captain who went crazy and imagined he was the Flying Dutchman." This was Captain Jim's best story. It was a compound of horror and humor, and though Anne had heard it several times, she laughed as heartily and shivered as fearsomely over it as Mr. Ford did. Other tales followed, for Captain Jim had an audience after his own heart. He told how his vessel had been run down by a steamer, how he had been boarded by Malay pirates, how his ship had caught fire, how he had helped a political prisoner escape from a South African republic, how he had been wrecked one fall on the Magdalens and stranded there for the winter, how a tiger had broken loose on board ship, how his crew had mutinied and marooned him on a barren island. These and many other tales, tragic or humorous or grotesque, did Captain Jim relate. The mystery of the sea, the fascination of far lands, the lure of adventure, the laughter of the world, his hearers felt and realized them all. Owen Ford listened, with his head on his hand and the first mate purring on his knee, his brilliant eyes fastened on Captain Jim's rugged, eloquent face. "Won't you let Mr. Ford see your life book, Captain Jim?" asked Anne, when Captain Jim finally declared that yarn spinning must end for the time. "Oh, we don't want to be bothered with that," protested Captain Jim, who was secretly dying to show it. "I should like nothing better than to see it, Captain Boyd," said Owen. "If it is half as wonderful as your tales, it will be worth seeing." With pretend reluctance, Captain Jim dug his life book out of his old chest and handed it to Owen. "I reckon you won't care to wrastle long with my old hand o' write. I never had much schooling," he observed carelessly. "Just wrote that there to amuse my nephew Joe. He's always wanting stories. Comes here yesterday and says to me reproachful like, as I was lifting a 20-pound codfish out of my boat, 'Uncle Jim, ain't a codfish a dumb animal?' I'd been a-telling him, you see, that he must be real kind to dumb animals and never hurt 'em in any way. I got out of the scrape by saying a codfish was dumb enough, but it wasn't an animal. But Joe didn't look satisfied, and I wasn't satisfied myself. You gotta be mighty careful what you tell them little critters. They can see through you." While talking, Captain Jim watched Owen Ford from the corner of his eye as the latter examined the life book, and presently observing that his guest was lost in its pages, he turned smilingly to his cupboard and proceeded to make a pot of tea. Owen Ford separated himself from the life book with as much reluctance as a miser wrenches himself from his gold, long enough to drink his tea, and then returned to it hungrily. "Oh, you can take that thing home with you if you want," said Captain Jim, as if the thing were not his most treasured possession. "I must go down and pull my boat up a bit on the skids. There's a wind coming. Did you notice the sky tonight? Mackerel skies and mare's tails make tall ships carry short sails." Owen Ford accepted the offer of the life book gladly. On their way home, Anne told him the story of lost Margaret. "That old captain is a wonderful old fellow," he said. "What a life he has led! Why, the man has had more adventures in 1 week of his life than most of us have in a lifetime. Do you really think his tales are all true?" "I certainly do. I am sure Captain Jim could not tell a lie. And besides, all the people about here say that everything happened as he relates it. There used to be plenty of his old shipmates alive to corroborate him. He's one of the last of the old type of P.E. Island sea captains. They're almost extinct now." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. The Writing of the Book. Owen Ford came over to the little house the next morning in a state of great excitement. "Mrs. Blythe, this is a wonderful book, absolutely wonderful. If I could take it and use the material for a book, I feel certain I could make the novel of the year out of it. Do you suppose Captain Jim would let me do it?" "Let you? I'm sure he would be delighted," cried Anne. "I admit that it was what was in my head when I took you down last night. Captain Jim has always been wishing he could get somebody to write his life book properly for him. Will you go down to the Point with me this evening, Mrs. Blythe? I'll ask him about that life book myself, but I want you to tell him that you told me the story of lost Margaret, and ask him if he will let me use it as a thread of romance with which to weave the stories of the life book into a harmonious whole." Captain Jim was more excited than ever when Owen Ford told him of his plan. At last his cherished dream was to be realized and his life book given to the world. He was also pleased that the story of lost Margaret should be woven into it. "It will keep her name from being forgotten," he said wistfully. "That's why I want it put in." "We'll collaborate," cried Owen delightedly. "You will give the soul and I the body. Oh, we'll write a famous book between us, Captain Jim, and we'll get right to work." "And to think my book is to be writ by the schoolmaster's grandson," exclaimed Captain Jim. "Lad, your grandfather was my dearest friend. I thought there was nobody like him. I see now why I had to wait so long. It couldn't be writ till the right man come. You belong here. You've got the soul of this old North Shore in you. You're the only one who could write it." It was arranged that the tiny room off the living room at the lighthouse should be given over to Owen for a workshop. It was necessary that Captain Jim should be near him as he wrote, for consultation upon many matters of seafaring and Gulf lore, of which Owen was quite ignorant. He began work on the book the very next morning, and flung himself into it heart and soul. As for Captain Jim, he was a happy man that summer. He looked upon the little room where Owen worked as a sacred shrine. Owen talked everything over with Captain Jim, but he would not let him see the manuscript. "You must wait until it is published," he said. "Then you'll get it all at once in its best shape." He delved into the treasures of the life book and used them freely. He dreamed and brooded over lost Margaret until she became a vivid reality to him and lived in his pages. As the book progressed, it took possession of him, and he worked at it with feverish eagerness. He let Anne and Leslie read the manuscript and criticize it, and the concluding chapter of the book, which the critics later on were pleased to call idyllic, was modeled upon a suggestion of Leslie's. Anne fairly hugged herself with delight over the success of her idea. "I knew when I looked at Owen Ford that he was the very man for it," she told Gilbert. "Both humor and passion were in his face, and that, together with the art of expression, was just what was necessary for the writing of such a book. As Mrs. Rachel would say, he was predestined for the part." Owen Ford wrote in the mornings. The afternoons were generally spent in some merry outing with the Blythes. Leslie often went too, for Captain Jim took charge of Dick frequently in order to set her free. They went boating on the harbor and up the 3 pretty rivers that flowed into it. They had clam bakes on the bar and mussel bakes on the rocks. They picked strawberries on the sand dunes. They went out cod fishing with Captain Jim. They shot plover in the shore fields and wild ducks in the cove. At least the men did. In the evenings they rambled in the low-lying, daisied shore fields under a golden moon, or they sat in the living room at the little house, where often the coolness of the sea breeze justified a driftwood fire, and talked of the 1,001 things which happy, eager, clever young people can find to talk about. Ever since the day on which she had made her confession to Anne, Leslie had been a changed creature. There was no trace of her old coldness and reserve, no shadow of her old bitterness. The girlhood of which she had been cheated seemed to come back to her with the ripeness of womanhood. She expanded like a flower of flame and perfume. No laugh was readier than hers, no wit quicker in the twilight circles of that enchanted summer. When she could not be with them, all felt that some exquisite savor was lacking in their intercourse. Her beauty was illumined by the awakened soul within, as some rosy lamp might shine through a flawless vase of alabaster. There were hours when Anne's eyes seemed to ache with the splendor of her. As for Owen Ford, the Margaret of his book, although she had the soft brown hair and elfin face of the real girl who had vanished so long ago, pillowed where lost Atlantis sleeps, had the personality of Leslie Moore, as it was revealed to him in those halcyon days at Four Winds Harbor. All in all, it was a never-to-be-forgotten summer, one of those summers which come seldom into any life, but leave a rich heritage of beautiful memories in their going, one of those summers which, in a fortunate combination of delightful weather, delightful friends, and delightful doings come as near to perfection as anything can come in this world. Too good to last, Anne told herself with a little sigh on the September day when a certain nip in the wind and a certain shade of intense blue on the Gulf water said that autumn was hard by. That evening Owen Ford told him that he had finished his book and that his vacation must come to an end. "I have a good deal to do to it yet, revising and pruning and so forth," he said, "but in the main it's done. I wrote the last sentence this morning. If I can find a publisher for it, it will probably be out next summer or fall." Owen had not much doubt that he would find a publisher. He knew that he had written a great book, a book that would score a wonderful success, a book that would live. He knew that it would bring him both fame and fortune, but when he had written the last line of it, he had bowed his head on the manuscript and so sat for a long time, and his thoughts were not of the good work he had done. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26. Owen Ford's Confession. "I'm so sorry Gilbert is away," said Anne. "He had to go. Alan Lyons at the Glen has met with a serious accident. He will not likely be home till very late. But he told me to tell you he'd be up and over early enough in the morning to see you before you left. It's too provoking. Susan and I had planned such a nice little jamboree for your last night here." She was sitting beside the garden brook on the little rustic seat Gilbert had built. Owen Ford stood before her, leaning against the bronze column of a yellow birch. He was very pale, and his face bore the marks of the preceding sleepless night. Anne, glancing up at him, wondered if, after all, his summer had brought him the strength it should. Had he worked too hard over his book? She remembered that for a week he had not been looking well. "I'm rather glad the doctor is away," said Owen slowly. "I wanted to see you alone, Mrs. Blythe. There is something I must tell somebody, or I think it will drive me mad. I've been trying for a week to look it in the face, and I can't. I know I can trust you, and besides, you will understand. A woman with eyes like yours always understands. You are one of the folks people instinctively tell things to. Mrs. Blythe, I love Leslie. Love her. That seems too weak a word." His voice suddenly broke with the suppressed passion of his utterance. He turned his head away and hid his face on his arm. His whole form shook. Anne sat looking at him, pale and aghast. She had never thought of this. And yet, how was it she had never thought of it? It now seemed a natural and inevitable thing. She wondered at her own blindness. But things like this did not happen in Four Winds. Elsewhere in the world, human passions might set at defiance human conventions and laws, but not here, surely. Leslie had kept summer boarders off and on for 10 years, and nothing like this had happened. But perhaps they had not been like Owen Ford, and the vivid, living Leslie of this summer was not the cold, sullen girl of other years. Oh, somebody should have thought of this. Why hadn't Miss Cornelia thought of it? Miss Cornelia was always ready enough to sound the alarm where men were concerned. Anne felt an unreasonable resentment against Miss Cornelia. Then she gave a little inward groan. No matter who was to blame, the mischief was done. And Leslie? What of Leslie? It was for Leslie Anne felt most concerned. "Does Leslie know this, Mr. Ford?" she asked quietly. No, unless she has guessed it. You surely don't think I'd be cad and scoundrel enough to tell her, Mrs. Blythe. I couldn't help loving her, that's all, and my misery is greater than I can bear." "Does she care?" asked Anne. The moment the question crossed her lips, she felt that she should not have asked it. Owen Ford answered it with overeager protest. No, of course not. But I could make her care if she were free. I know I could." "She does care, and he knows it," thought Anne. Aloud she said sympathetically but decidedly, "But she is not free, Mr. Ford, and the only thing you can do is to go away in silence and leave her to her own life." I know," groaned Owen. He sat down on the grassy bank and stared moodily into the amber water beneath him. "I know there's nothing to do. Nothing but to say conventionally, 'Goodbye, Mrs. Moore. Thank you for all your kindness to me this summer,' just as I would have said it to the sonsy, bustling, keen-eyed housewife I expected her to be when I came. Then I'll pay my board money like any honest boarder and go. Oh, it's very simple. No doubt, no perplexity, a straight road to the end of the world. And I'll walk it. You needn't fear that I won't, Mrs. Blythe. But it would be easier to walk over red-hot plowshares." Anne flinched with the pain of his voice, and there was so little she could say that would be adequate to the situation. Blame was out of the question. Advice was not needed. Sympathy was mocked by the man's stark agony. She could only feel with him in a maze of compassion and regret. Her heart ached for Leslie. Had not that poor girl suffered enough without this? "It wouldn't be so hard to go and leave her if she were only happy," resumed Owen passionately. "But to think of her living death, to realize what it is to which I do leave her, that is the worst of all. I would give my life to make her happy, and I can do nothing even to help her. Nothing. She is bound forever to that poor wretch, with nothing to look forward to but growing old in a succession of empty, meaningless, barren years. It drives me mad to think of it. But I must go through my life, never seeing her, but always knowing what she is enduring. It's hideous, hideous." "It is very hard," said Anne sorrowfully. "We, her friends here, all know how hard it is for her." "And she is so richly fitted for life," said Owen rebelliously. "Her beauty is the least of her dower, and she is the most beautiful woman I've ever known. That laugh of hers! I've angled all summer to evoke that laugh, just for the delight of hearing it. And her eyes! They are as deep and blue as the gulf out there. I never saw such blueness. And gold! Did you ever see her hair down, Mrs. Blythe?" "No." "I did. Once. I had gone down to the Point to go fishing with Captain Jim, but it was too rough to go out, so I came back. She had taken the opportunity of what she expected to be an afternoon alone to wash her hair, and she was standing on the veranda in the sunshine to dry it. It fell all about her to her feet in a fountain of living gold. When she saw me, she hurried in, and the wind caught her hair and swirled it all around her. Danae and her cloud. Somehow, just then, the knowledge that I loved her came home to me, and realized that I had loved her from the moment I first saw her standing against the darkness in that glow of light. And she must live on here, petting and soothing Dick, pinching and saving for a mere existence, while I spend my life longing vainly for her, and debarred by that very fact from even giving her the little help a friend might. I walked the shore last night, almost till dawn, and thrashed it all out over and over again. And yet, in spite of everything, I can't find it in my heart to be sorry that I came to Four Winds. It seems to me that, bad as everything is, it would be still worse never to have known Leslie. It's burning, searing pain to love her and leave her, but not to have loved her is unthinkable. I suppose all this sounds very crazy. All these terrible emotions always do sound foolish when we put them into our inadequate words. They are not meant to be spoken, only felt and endured. I shouldn't have spoken it, but it has helped, some. At least it has given me strength to go away respectably tomorrow morning without making a scene. You'll write me now and then, won't you, Mrs. Blythe, and give me what news there is to give of her?" "Yes," said Anne. "Oh, I'm so sorry you are going. We'll miss you so. We've all been such friends. If it were not for this, you could come back other summers. Perhaps even yet, by and by, when you've forgotten, perhaps." "I shall never forget, and I shall never come back to Four Winds," said Owen briefly. Silence and twilight fell over the garden. Far away the sea was lapping gently and monotonously on the bar. The wind of evening in the poplars sounded like some sad, weird old rune, some broken dream of old memories. A slender, shapely young aspen rose up before them against the fine maize and emerald and paling rose of the western sky, which brought out every leaf and twig in dark, tremulous, elfin loveliness. "Isn't that beautiful?" said Owen, pointing to it with the air of a man who puts a certain conversation behind him. "It's so beautiful that it hurts me," said Anne softly. "Perfect things like that always did hurt me. I remember I called it the queer ache when I was a child. What is the reason that pain like this seems inseparable from perfection? Is it the pain of finality, when we realize that there can be nothing beyond but retrogression?" "Perhaps," said Owen dreamily, "it is the prisoned infinite in us calling out to its kindred infinite, as expressed in that visible perfection. You seem to have a cold in the head. Better rub some tallow on your nose when you go to bed," said Miss Cornelia, who had come in through the little gate between the firs in time to catch Owen's last remark. Miss Cornelia liked Owen, but it was a matter of principle with her to visit any highfalutin language from a man with a snub. Miss Cornelia personated the comedy that ever peeps around the corner at the tragedy of life. Anne, whose nerves had been rather strained, laughed hysterically, and even Owen smiled. Certainly sentiment and passion had a way of shrinking out of sight in Miss Cornelia's presence. And yet to Anne nothing seemed quite as hopeless and dark and painful as it had seemed a few moments before, but sleep was far from her eyes that night. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27. On the Sandbar. Owen Ford left Four Winds the next morning. In the evening Anne went over to see Leslie, but found nobody. The house was locked, and there was no light in any window. It looked like a home left soulless. Leslie did not run over on the following day, which Anne thought a bad sign. Gilbert having occasion to go in the evening to the fishing cove, Anne drove with him to the Point, intending to stay a while with Captain Jim, but the great light, cutting its swathes through the fog of the autumn evening, was in care of Alec Boyd, and Captain Jim was away. "What will you do?" asked Gilbert. "Come with me?" "I don't want to go to the cove, but I'll go over the channel with you and roam about on the sand shore till you come back. The rock shore is too slippery and grim tonight." Alone on the sands of the bar, Anne gave herself up to the eerie charm of the night. It was warm for September, and the late afternoon had been very foggy, but a full moon had in part lessened the fog and transformed the harbor and the gulf and the surrounding shores into a strange, fantastic, unreal world of pale silver mist through which everything loomed phantom-like. Captain Josiah Crawford's black schooner sailing down the channel, laden with potatoes for Bluenose ports, was a spectral ship bound for a far uncharted land, ever receding, never to be reached. The calls of unseen gulls overhead were the cries of the souls of doomed seamen. The little curls of foam that blew across the sand were elfin things stealing up from the sea caves. The big, round-shouldered sand dunes were the sleeping giants of some old northern tale. The lights that glimmered palely across the harbor were the delusive beacons on some coast of fairyland. Anne pleased herself with 100 fancies as she wandered through the mist. It was delightful, romantic, mysterious to be roaming here alone on this enchanted shore. But was she alone? Something loomed in the mist before her, took shape and form, suddenly moved towards her across the wave-rippled sand. "Leslie!" exclaimed Anne in amazement. "Whatever are you doing here tonight?" "If it comes to that, whatever are you doing here?" said Leslie, trying to laugh. The effort was a failure. She looked very pale and tired, but the love locks under her scarlet cap were curling about her face and eyes like little sparkling rings of gold. "I'm waiting for Gilbert. He's over at the cove. I intended to stay at the light, but Captain Jim is away." "Well, I came here because I wanted to walk and walk and walk," said Leslie restlessly. "I couldn't on the rock shore. The tide was too high and the rocks prisoned me. I had to come here, or I should have gone mad, I think. I rowed myself over the channel in Captain Jim's flat. I've been here for an hour. Come, let us walk. I can't stand still. Oh, Anne." "Leslie, dearest, what is the trouble?" asked Anne, though she knew too well already. "I can't tell you. Don't ask me. I wouldn't mind your knowing. I wish you did know. But I can't tell you. I can't tell anyone. I've been such a fool, Anne. And oh, it hurts so terribly to be a fool. There's nothing so painful in the world." She laughed bitterly. Anne slipped her arm around her. "Leslie, is it that you have learned to care for Mr. Ford?" Leslie turned herself about passionately. "How did you know?" she cried. "Anne, how did you know? Oh, is it written in my face for everyone to see? Is it as plain as that?" No. I can't tell you how I knew. It just came into my mind somehow. Leslie, don't look at me like that." "Do you despise me?" demanded Leslie in a fierce, low tone. "Do you think I'm wicked, unwomanly? Or do you think I'm just plain fool?" "I don't think you any of those things. Come, dear, Let's just talk it over sensibly, as we might talk over any other of the great crises of life. You've been brooding over it and let yourself drift into a morbid view of it. You know you have a little tendency to do that about everything that goes wrong, and you promised me that you would fight against it." "But oh, it's so shameful," murmured Leslie, "to love him unsought, and when I'm not free to love anybody." "There's nothing shameful about it. But I'm very sorry that you have learned to care for Owen, because as things are, it will only make you more unhappy." "I didn't learn to care," said Leslie, walking on and speaking passionately. "If it had been like that, I could have prevented it. I never dreamed of such a thing until that day, a week ago, when he told me he had finished his book and must soon go away. Then I knew. I felt as if someone had struck me a terrible blow. I didn't say anything. I couldn't speak. But I don't know what I looked like. I'm so afraid my face betrayed me. Oh, I would die of shame if I thought he knew, or suspected." Anne was miserably silent, hampered by her deductions from her conversation with Owen. Leslie went on feverishly, as if she found relief in speech. "I was so happy all this summer, Anne, happier than I ever was in my life. I thought it was because everything had been made clear between you and me, and that it was our friendship which made life seem so beautiful and full once more. And it was, in part, but not all. Oh, not nearly all. I know now why everything was so different. And now it's all over, and he is gone. How can I live, Anne? When I turned back into the house this morning after he had gone, the solitude struck me like a blow in the face." "It won't seem so hard by and by, dear," said Anne, who always felt the pain of her friends so keenly that she could not speak easy, fluent words of comforting. Besides, she remembered how well-meant speeches had hurt her in her own sorrow, and was afraid. "Oh, it seems to me it will grow harder all the time," said Leslie miserably. "I've nothing to look forward to. Morning will come after morning, and he will not come back. He will never come back. Oh, when I think that I will never see him again, I feel as if a great brutal hand had twisted itself among my heartstrings and was wrenching them. Once, long ago, I dreamed of love, and I thought it must be beautiful. And now it's like this. When he went away yesterday morning he was so cold and indifferent. He said, 'Goodbye, Mrs. Moore,' in the coldest tone in the world, as if we had not even been friends, as if I meant absolutely nothing to him. I know I don't. I didn't want him to care, but he might have been a little kinder." "Oh, I wish Gilbert would come," thought Anne. She was racked between her sympathy for Leslie and the necessity of avoiding anything that would betray Owen's confidence. She knew why his goodbye had been so cold, why it could not have the cordiality that their good comradeship demanded, but she could not tell Leslie. "I couldn't help it, Anne. I couldn't help it," said poor Leslie. "I know that. Do you blame me so very much?" "I don't blame you at all." "And you won't tell Gilbert?" "Leslie! Do you think I would do such a thing?" "Oh, I don't know. You and Gilbert are such chums. I don't see how you could help telling him everything." "Everything about my own concerns, yes, but not my friend's secrets." "I couldn't have him know, but I'm glad you know. I would feel guilty if there were anything I was ashamed to tell you. I hope Miss Cornelia won't find out. Sometimes I feel as if those terrible, kind brown eyes of hers read my very soul. Oh, I wish this mist would never lift. I wish I could just stay in it forever, hidden away from every living being. I don't see how I can go on with life. This summer has been so full. I never was lonely for a moment. Before Owen came, there used to be horrible moments when I had been with you and Gilbert and then had to leave you. You two would walk away together and I would walk away alone. After Owen came, he was always there to walk home with me. We would laugh and talk as you and Gilbert were doing. There were no more lonely, envious moments for me. And now, oh yes, I've been a fool. Let's have done talking about my folly. I'll never bore you with it again." "Here is Gilbert, and you are coming back with us," said Anne, who had no intention of leaving Leslie to wander alone on the sandbar on such a night and in such a mood. "There's plenty of room in our boat for 3, and we'll tie the flat on behind." "Oh, I suppose I must reconcile myself to being the odd one again," said poor Leslie with another bitter laugh. "Forgive me, Anne, that was hateful. I ought to be thankful, and I am, that I have two good friends who are glad to count me in as a third. Don't mind my hateful speeches. I just seem to be one great pain all over, and everything hurts me." "Leslie seemed very quiet tonight, didn't she?" said Gilbert, when he and Anne reached home. "What in the world was she doing over there on the bar alone?" "Oh, she was tired, and you know she likes to go to the shore after one of Dick's bad days." "What a pity she hadn't met and married a fellow like Ford long ago," ruminated Gilbert. "They'd have made an ideal couple, wouldn't they?" "For pity's sake, Gilbert, don't develop into a matchmaker. It's an abominable profession for a man," cried Anne rather sharply, afraid that Gilbert might blunder on the truth if he kept on in this strain. "Bless us, Anne girl, I'm not matchmaking," protested Gilbert, rather surprised at her tone. "I was only thinking of one of the might-have-beens." "Well, don't. It's a waste of time," said Anne. Then she added suddenly, "Oh, Gilbert, I wish everybody could be as happy as we are." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28. Odds and Ends. "I've been reading obituary notices," said Miss Cornelia, laying down the Daily Enterprise and taking up her sewing. The harbor was lying black and sullen under a dour November sky. The wet, dead leaves clung drenched and sodden to the window sills, but the little house was gay with firelight and spring-like with Anne's ferns and geraniums. "It's always summer here, Anne," Leslie had said one day, and all who were the guests of that house of dreams felt the same. "The Enterprise seems to run to obituaries these days," quoth Miss Cornelia. "It always has a couple of columns of them, and I read every line. It's one of my forms of recreation, especially when there's some original poetry attached to them. Here's a choice sample for you. 'She's gone to be with her Maker, never more to roam. She used to play and sing with joy the song of Home, Sweet Home.' Who says we haven't any poetical talent on the island? Have you ever noticed what heaps of good people die, Anne dearie? It's kind of pitiful. Here's 10 obituaries, and every one of them saints and models, even the men. Here's old Peter Stimson, who has left a large circle of friends to mourn his untimely loss. Lord, Anne dearie, that man was 80, and every one who knew him had been wishing him dead these 30 years. Read obituaries when you're blue, Anne dearie, especially the ones of folks you know. If you've any sense of humor at all, they'll cheer you up, believe me. I just wish I had the writing of the obituaries of some people. Isn't obituary an awful ugly word? This very Peter I've been speaking of had a face exactly like one. I never saw it, but I thought of the word obituary then and there. There's only one uglier word that I know of, and that's relict. Lord, Anne dearie, I may be an old maid, but there's this comfort in it. I'll never be any man's relict." "It is an ugly word," said Anne, laughing. "Avonlea graveyard was full of old tombstones sacred to the memory of so-and-so, relict of the late so-and-so. It always made me think of something worn out and moth-eaten. Why is it that so many of the words connected with death are so disagreeable? I do wish that the custom of calling a dead body the remains could be abolished. I positively shiver when I hear the undertaker say at a funeral, 'All who wish to see the remains, please step this way.' It always gives me the horrible impression that I am about to view the scene of a cannibal feast." "Well, all I hope," said Miss Cornelia calmly, "is that when I'm dead nobody will call me our departed sister. I took a scunner at this sister and brothering business 5 years ago, when there was a traveling evangelist holding meetings at the Glen. I hadn't any use for him from the start. I felt in my bones that there was something wrong with him, and there was. Mind you, he was pretending to be a Presbyterian, he called it, and all the time he was a Methodist. He brothered and sistered everybody. He had a large circle of relations, that man had. He clutched my hand fervently one night and said imploringly, 'My dear Sister Bryant, are you a Christian?' I just looked him over a bit, and then I said calmly, 'The only brother I ever had, Mr. Fiske, was buried 15 years ago, and I haven't adopted any since. As for being a Christian, I was that, I hope and believe, when you were crawling about the floor in petticoats.' That squelched him, believe me. Mind you, Anne dearie, I'm not down on all evangelists. We've had some real fine, earnest men who did a lot of good and made the old sinners squirm. But this Fiske man wasn't one of them. I had a good laugh all to myself one evening. Fiske had asked all who were Christians to stand up.
I didn't, believe me. I never had any use for that sort of thing, but most of them did, and then he asked all who wanted to be Christians to stand up. Nobody stirred for a spell, so Fisk started up a hymn at the top of his voice. Just in front of me poor little Ikey Baker was sitting in the Millison pew. He was a homeboy, 10 years old, and Millison just about worked him to death. The poor little creature was always so tired he fell asleep right off whenever he went to church or anywhere he could sit still for a few minutes. He'd been sleeping all through the meeting, and I was thankful to see the poor child getting a rest, believe me. Well, when Fisk's voice went soaring skyward and the rest joined in, poor Ikey wakened with a start. He thought it was just an ordinary singing and that everybody ought to stand up, so he scrambled to his feet mighty quick, knowing he'd get a combing down from Maria Millison for sleeping in meeting. Fisk saw him, stopped, and shouted, "Another soul saved! Glory, hallelujah!" And there was poor, frightened Ikey, only half awake and yawning, never thinking about his soul at all. Poor child, he never had time to think of anything but his tired, overworked little body. Leslie went one night, and the Fisk man got right after her. Oh, he was especially anxious about the souls of the nice-looking girls, believe me, and he hurt her feelings, so she never went again. And then he prayed every night after that, right in public, that the Lord would soften her hard heart. Finally, I went to Mr. Levitt, our minister then, and told him if he didn't make Fisk stop, that I'd just rise up the next night and throw my hymn-book at him when he mentioned that beautiful but unrepentant young woman. I'd have done it, too, believe me. Mr. Levitt did put a stop to it, but Fisk kept on with his meetings until Charlie Douglas put an end to his career in the Glen. Mrs. Charlie had been out in California all winter. She'd been real melancholy in the fall. Religious melancholy, it ran in her family. Her father worried so much over believing that he had committed the unpardonable sin that he died in the asylum. So when Rose Douglas got that way, Charlie packed her off to visit her sister in Los Angeles. She got perfectly well and came home just when the Fisk revival was in full swing. She stepped off the train at the Glen, real smiling and chipper, and the first thing she saw staring her in the face on the black gable end of the freight shed was the question, in big white letters 2 feet high, "Whither goest thou, to heaven or hell?" That had been one of Fisk's ideas, and he got Henry Hammond to paint it. Rose just gave a shriek and fainted, and when they got her home she was worse than ever. Charlie Douglas went to Mr. Levitt and told him that every Douglas would leave the church if Fisk was kept there any longer. Mr. Levitt had to give in, for the Douglases paid half his salary, so Fisk departed, and we had to depend on our Bibles once more for instructions on how to get to heaven. After he was gone, Mr. Levitt found out he was just a masquerading Methodist, and he felt pretty sick, believe me. Mr. Levitt fell short in some ways, but he was a good, sound Presbyterian. "By the way, I had a letter from Mr. Ford yesterday," said Anne. "He asked me to remember him kindly to you." "I don't want his remembrances," said Miss Cornelia curtly. "Why?" said Anne in astonishment. "I thought you liked him." "Well, so I did in a kind of way, but I'll never forgive him for what he done to Leslie. There's that poor child eating her heart out about him as if she hadn't trouble enough, and him ranting round Toronto, I've no doubt, enjoying himself same as ever. Just like a man." "Oh, Miss Cornelia, how did you find out?" "Lord, Anne dearie, I've got eyes, haven't I? And I've known Leslie since she was a baby. There's been a new kind of heartbreak in her eyes all the fall, and I know that writer man was behind it somehow. I'll never forgive myself for being the means of bringing him here, but I never expected he'd be like he was. I thought he'd be just like the other men Leslie had boarded, conceited young asses, every one of them, that she never had any use for. One of them did try to flirt with her once, and she froze him out. So bad, I feel sure he's never got himself thawed since. So I never thought of any danger." "Don't let Leslie suspect you know her secret," said Anne hurriedly. "I think it would hurt her." "Trust me, Anne dearie, I wasn't born yesterday. Oh, a plague on all the men. One of them ruined Leslie's life to begin with, and now another of the tribe comes and makes her still more wretched. And this world is an awful place, believe me." "There's something in the world amiss will be unriddled by and by," quoted Anne dreamily. "If it is, it'll be in a world where there aren't any men," said Miss Cornelia gloomily. "What have the men been doing now?" asked Gilbert, entering. "Mischief, mischief. What else did they ever do?" "It was Eve ate the apple, Miss Cornelia." "'Twas a he creature tempted her," retorted Miss Cornelia triumphantly. Leslie, after her first anguish was over, found it possible to go on with life after all, as most of us do, no matter what our particular form of torment has been. It is even possible that she enjoyed moments of it when she was one of the gay circle in the little house of dreams. But if Anne ever hoped that she was forgetting Owen Ford, she would have been undeceived by the furtive hunger in Leslie's eyes whenever his name was mentioned. Pitiful to that hunger, Anne always contrived to tell Captain Jim or Gilbert bits of news from Owen's letters when Leslie was with them. The girl's flush and pallor at such moments spoke all too eloquently of the emotion that filled her being. But she never spoke of him to Anne, or mentioned that night on the sandbar. One day her old dog died, and she grieved bitterly over him. "He's been my friend so long," she said sorrowfully to Anne. "He was Dick's old dog, you know. Dick had him for a year or so before we were married. He left him with me when he sailed on the Four Sisters. Carlo got very fond of me, and his dog love helped me through that first dreadful year after Mother died, when I was alone. When I heard that Dick was coming back, I was afraid Carlo wouldn't be so much mine, but he never seemed to care for Dick, though he had been so fond of him once. He would snap and growl at him as if he were a stranger. I was glad. It was nice to have one thing whose love was all mine. That old dog has been such a comfort to me, Anne. He got so feeble in the fall that I was afraid he couldn't live long, but I hoped I could nurse him through the winter. He seemed pretty well this morning. He was lying on the rug before the fire. Then all at once he got up and crept over to me. He put his head on my lap and gave me one loving look out of his big, soft dog eyes, and then he just shivered and died. I shall miss him so." "Let me give you another dog, Leslie," said Anne. "I'm getting a lovely Gordon setter for a Christmas present for Gilbert. Let me give you one, too." Leslie shook her head. "Not just now, thank you, Anne. I don't feel like having another dog yet. I don't seem to have any affection left for another. Perhaps, in time, I'll let you give me one. I really need one as a kind of protection. But there was something almost human about Carlo. It wouldn't be decent to fill his place too hurriedly, dear old fellow." Anne went to Avonlea a week before Christmas and stayed until after the holidays. Gilbert came up for her, and there was a glad New Year celebration at Green Gables, when Barrys and Blythes and Wrights assembled to devour a dinner which had cost Mrs. Rachel and Marilla much careful thought and preparation. When they went back to Four Winds, the little house was almost drifted over, for the third storm of a winter that was to prove phenomenally stormy had whirled up the harbor and heaped huge snow mountains about everything it encountered. But Captain Jim had shoveled out doors and paths, and Miss Cornelia had come down and kindled the hearth fire. "It's good to see you back, Anne dearie. But did you ever see such drifts? You can't see the Moore place at all unless you go upstairs. Leslie'll be so glad you're back. She's almost buried alive over there. Fortunately, Dick can shovel snow and thinks it's great fun. Susan sent me word to tell you she would be on hand tomorrow. Where are you off to now, Captain?" "I reckon I'll plow up to the Glen and sit a bit with old Martin Strong. He's not far from his end, and he's lonesome. He hasn't many friends. Been too busy all his life to make any. He's made heaps of money, though." "Well, he thought that since he couldn't serve God and Mammon, he'd better stick to Mammon," said Miss Cornelia crisply. "So he shouldn't complain if he doesn't find Mammon very good company now." Captain Jim went out, but remembered something in the yard and turned back for a moment. "I'd a letter from Mr. Ford, Mistress Blythe, and he says the life book is accepted and is going to be published next fall. I felt fair uplifted when I got the news. To think that I'm to see it in print at last." "That man is clean crazy on the subject of his life book," said Miss Cornelia compassionately. "For my part, I think there's far too many books in the world now." End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29. Gilbert and Anne Disagree. Gilbert laid down the ponderous medical tome over which he had been poring until the increasing dusk of the March evening made him desist. He leaned back in his chair and gazed meditatively out of the window. It was early spring, probably the ugliest time of the year. Not even the sunset could redeem the dead, sodden landscape and rotten black harbor ice upon which he looked. No sign of life was visible, save a big black crow winging his solitary way across a leaden field. Gilbert speculated idly concerning that crow. Was he a family crow, with a black but comely crow wife awaiting him in the woods beyond the glen? Or was he a glossy young buck of a crow, on courting thoughts intent? Or was he a cynical bachelor crow, believing that he travels the fastest who travels alone? Whatever he was, he soon disappeared in congenial gloom, and Gilbert turned to the cheerier view indoors. The firelight flickered from point to point, gleaming on the white and green coats of Gog and Magog, on the sleek brown head of the beautiful setter basking on the rug, on the picture frames on the walls, on the vaseful of daffodils from the window garden, on Anne herself, sitting by her little table, with her sewing beside her, and her hands clasped over her knee, while she traced out pictures in the fire, castles in Spain, whose airy turrets pierced moonlit cloud, and sunset bar ships sailing from the haven of good hopes straight to Four Winds Harbor with precious burden. For Anne was again a dreamer of dreams, albeit a grim shape of fear went with her night and day to shadow and darken her visions. Gilbert was accustomed to refer to himself as an old married man, but he still looked upon Anne with the incredulous eyes of a lover. He couldn't wholly believe yet that she was really his. It might be only a dream after all, part and parcel of this magic house of dreams. His soul still went tiptoe before her, lest the charm be shattered and the dream dispelled. "Anne," he said slowly, "lend me your ears. I want to talk with you about something." Anne looked across at him through the firelit gloom. "What is it?" she asked gaily. "You look fearfully solemn, Gilbert. I really haven't done anything naughty today. Ask Susan." "It's not of you, or ourselves, I want to talk. It's about Dick Moore." "Dick Moore?" echoed Anne, sitting up alertly. "Why, what in the world have you to say about Dick Moore?" "I've been thinking a great deal about him lately. Do you remember that time last summer I treated him for those carbuncles on his neck?" "Yes, yes." "I took the opportunity to examine the scars on his head thoroughly. I've always thought Dick was a very interesting case from a medical point of view. Lately I've been studying the history of trephining and the cases where it has been employed. Anne, I have come to the conclusion that if Dick Moore were taken to a good hospital and the operation of trephining performed on several places in his skull, his memory and faculties might be restored." "Gilbert!" Anne's voice was full of protest. "Surely you don't mean it." "I do indeed. And I have decided that it is my duty to broach the subject to Leslie." "Gilbert Blythe, you shall not do any such thing," cried Anne vehemently. "Oh, Gilbert, you won't, you won't. You couldn't be so cruel. Promise me you won't." "Why, Anne girl, I didn't suppose you would take it like this. Be reasonable." "I won't be reasonable. I can't be reasonable. I am reasonable. It is you who are unreasonable. Gilbert, have you ever once thought what it would mean for Leslie if Dick Moore were to be restored to his right senses? Just stop and think. She's unhappy enough now, but life as Dick's nurse and attendant is 1,000 times easier for her than life as Dick's wife. I know. It's unthinkable. Don't you meddle with the matter. Leave well enough alone." "I have thought over that aspect of the case thoroughly, Anne. But I believe that a doctor is bound to set the sanctity of a patient's mind and body above all other considerations, no matter what the consequences may be. I believe it is his duty to endeavor to restore health and sanity if there is any hope whatever of it." "But Dick isn't your patient in that respect," cried Anne, taking another tack. "If Leslie had asked you if anything could be done for him, then it might be your duty to tell her what you really thought. But you've no right to meddle." "I don't call it meddling. Uncle Dave told Leslie 12 years ago that nothing could be done for Dick. She believes that, of course." "And why did Uncle Dave tell her that if it wasn't true?" cried Anne triumphantly. "Doesn't he know as much about it as you?" "I think not, though it may sound conceited and presumptuous to say it. And you know as well as I that he is rather prejudiced against what he calls these new-fangled notions of cutting and carving. He's even opposed to operating for appendicitis." "He's right," exclaimed Anne, with a complete change of front. "I believe myself that you modern doctors are entirely too fond of making experiments with human flesh and blood." "Rhoda Allonby would not be a living woman today if I had been afraid of making a certain experiment," argued Gilbert.
I took the risk and saved her life."
"I'm sick and tired of hearing about Rhoda Allonby," cried Anne, most unjustly, for Gilbert had never mentioned Mrs. Allonby's name since the day he had told Anne of his success in regard to her. And he could not be blamed for other people's discussion of it. Gilbert felt rather hurt.
"I had not expected you to look at the matter as you do, Anne," he said a little stiffly, getting up and moving towards the office door. It was their first approach to a quarrel. But Anne flew after him and dragged him back.
"Now, Gilbert, you are not going off mad. Sit down here and I'll apologize beautifully. I shouldn't have said that. But, oh, if you knew—"
Anne checked herself just in time. She had been on the very verge of betraying Leslie's secret.
"Knew what a woman feels about it," she concluded lamely.
"I think I do know. I've looked at the matter from every point of view, and I've been driven to the conclusion that it is my duty to tell Leslie that I believe it is possible that Dick can be restored to himself. There my responsibility ends. It will be for her to decide what she will do."
"I don't think you've any right to put such a responsibility on her. She has enough to bear. She is poor. How could she afford such an operation?"
"That is for her to decide," persisted Gilbert stubbornly.
"You say you think that Dick can be cured. But are you sure of it?"
"Certainly not. Nobody could be sure of such a thing. There may have been lesions on the brain itself, the effect of which can never be removed. But if, as I believe, his loss of memory and other faculties is due merely to the pressure on the brain centers of certain depressed areas of bone, then he can be cured."
"But it's only a possibility," insisted Anne. "Now, suppose you tell Leslie and she decides to have the operation. It will cost a great deal. She will have to borrow the money or sell her little property. And suppose the operation is a failure and Dick remains the same. How will she be able to pay back the money she borrows or make a living for herself and that big, helpless creature if she sells the farm?"
"Oh, I know. But it is my duty to tell her. I can't get away from that conviction."
"Oh, I know the Blythe stubbornness," groaned Anne. "But don't do this solely on your own responsibility. Consult Dr. Dave."
"I have done so," said Gilbert reluctantly.
"And what did he say?"
"In brief, as you say, leave well enough alone. Apart from his prejudice against newfangled surgery, I'm afraid he looks at the case from your point of view. Don't do it for Leslie's sake."
"There now," cried Anne triumphantly. "I do think, Gilbert, that you ought to abide by the judgment of a man nearly 80, who has seen a great deal and saved scores of lives himself. Surely his opinion ought to weigh more than a mere boy's."
"Thank you."
"Don't laugh. It's too serious."
"That's just my point. It is serious. Here is a man who is a helpless burden. He may be restored to reason and usefulness."
"He was so very useful before," interjected Anne witheringly.
"He may be given a chance to make good and redeem the past. His wife doesn't know this. I do. It is therefore my duty to tell her that there is such a possibility. That, boiled down, is my decision."
"Don't say decision yet, Gilbert. Consult somebody else. Ask Captain Jim what he thinks about it."
"Very well. But I'll not promise to abide by his opinion, Anne. This is something a man must decide for himself. My conscience would never be easy if I kept silent on the subject."
"Oh, your conscience," moaned Anne. "I suppose that Uncle Dave has a conscience too, hasn't he?"
"Yes, but I am not the keeper of his conscience. Come, Anne, if this affair did not concern Leslie, if it were a purely abstract case, you would agree with me. You know you would."
"I wouldn't,"
vowed Anne, trying to believe it herself.
"Oh, you can argue all night, Gilbert, but you won't convince me. Just you ask Miss Cornelia what she thinks of it."
"You're driven to the last ditch, Anne, when you bring up Miss Cornelia as a reinforcement. She will say, 'just like a man,' and rage furiously. No matter. This is no affair for Miss Cornelia to settle. Leslie alone must decide it."
"You know very well how she will decide it," said Anne, almost in tears. "She has ideals of duty, too. I don't see how you can take such a responsibility on your shoulders. I couldn't."
"'Because right is right to follow right, were wisdom in the scorn of consequence,'" quoted Gilbert.
"Oh, you think a couplet of poetry a convincing argument," scoffed Anne. "That is so like a man."
And then she laughed in spite of herself. It sounded so like an echo of Miss Cornelia.
Well, if you won't accept Tennyson as an authority, perhaps you will believe the words of a greater than he, said Gilbert seriously. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I believe that, Anne, with all my heart. It's the greatest and grandest verse in the Bible, or in any literature, and the truest, if there are comparative degrees of trueness. And it's the first duty of a man to tell the truth, as he sees it and believes it. In this case, the truth won't make poor Leslie free, sighed Anne. It will probably end in still more bitter bondage for her. Oh, Gilbert, I can't think you are right. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30. Leslie Decides. A sudden outbreak of a virulent type of influenza at the Glen and down at the fishing village kept Gilbert so busy for the next fortnight that he had no time to pay the promised visit to Captain Jim. Anne hoped against hope that he had abandoned the idea about Dick Moore, and resolving to let sleeping dogs lie, she said no more about the subject. But she thought of it incessantly. I wonder if it would be right for me to tell him that Leslie cares for Owen, she thought. He would never let her suspect that he knew, so her pride would not suffer, and it might convince him that he should let Dick Moore alone. Shall I? Shall I? No, after all, I cannot. A promise is sacred, and I've no right to betray Leslie's secret. But, oh, I never felt so worried over anything in my life as I do over this. It's spoiling the spring. It's spoiling everything. One evening Gilbert abruptly proposed that they go down and see Captain Jim. With a sinking heart, Anne agreed, and they set forth. 2 weeks of kind sunshine had wrought a miracle in the bleak landscape over which Gilbert's crow had flown. The hills and fields were dry and brown and warm, ready to break into bud and blossom. The harbor was laughter-shaken again. The long harbor road was like a gleaming red ribbon. Down on the dunes a crowd of boys, who were out smelt fishing, were burning the thick, dry sandhill grass of the preceding summer. The flames swept over the dunes rosily, flinging their cardinal banners against the dark gulf beyond, and illuminating the channel and the fishing village. It was a picturesque scene which would at other times have delighted Anne's eyes, but she was not enjoying this walk. Neither was Gilbert. Their usual good comradeship and Josephian community of taste and viewpoint were sadly lacking. Anne's disapproval of the whole project showed itself in the haughty uplift of her head and the studied politeness of her remarks. Gilbert's mouth was set in all the Blythe obstinacy, but his eyes were troubled. He meant to do what he believed to be his duty, but to be at outs with Anne was a high price to pay. Altogether, they were both glad when they reached the light, and remorseful that they should be glad. Captain Jim put away the fishing net upon which he was working and welcomed them joyfully. In the searching light of the spring evening he looked older than Anne had ever seen him. His hair had grown much grayer, and the strong old hand shook a little. But his blue eyes were clear and steady, and the staunch soul looked out through them gallant and unafraid. Captain Jim listened in amazed silence while Gilbert said what he had come to say. Anne, who knew how the old man worshipped Leslie, felt quite sure that he would side with her, although she had not much hope that this would influence Gilbert. She was therefore surprised beyond measure when Captain Jim, slowly and sorrowfully but unhesitatingly, gave it as his opinion that Leslie should be told. "Oh, Captain Jim, I didn't think you'd say that," she exclaimed reproachfully. "I thought you wouldn't want to make more trouble for her." Captain Jim shook his head. "I don't want to. I know how you feel about it, Mistress Blythe, just as I feel myself. But it ain't our feelings we have to steer by through life. No, we'd make shipwreck mighty often if we did that. There's only the one safe compass, and we've got to set our course by that, what it's right to do. I agree with the doctor. If there's a chance for Dick, Leslie should be told of it. There's no two sides to that, in my opinion." "Well," said Anne, giving up in despair, "wait until Miss Cornelia gets after you two men." "Cornelia'll rake us fore and aft, no doubt," assented Captain Jim. "You women are lovely critters, Mistress Blythe, but you're just a mite illogical. You're a highly educated lady, and Cornelia isn't, but you're like as two peas when it comes to that. I don't know as you're any the worse for it. Logic is a sort of hard, merciless thing, I reckon." Now I'll brew up a cup of tea and we'll drink it and talk of pleasant things, just to calm our minds a bit." At least Captain Jim's tea and conversation calmed Anne's mind to such an extent that she did not make Gilbert suffer so acutely on the way home as she had deliberately intended to do. She did not refer to the burning question at all, but she chatted amiably of other matters, and Gilbert understood that he was forgiven under protest. "Captain Jim seems very frail and bent this spring. The winter has aged him," said Anne sadly. "I am afraid that he will soon be going to seek lost Margaret. I can't bear to think of it." "Four Winds won't be the same place when Captain Jim sets out to sea," agreed Gilbert. The following evening he went to the house up the brook. Anne wandered dismally around until his return. "Well, what did Leslie say?" she demanded when he came in. "Very little. I think she felt rather dazed." "And is she going to have the operation?" "She is going to think it over and decide very soon." Gilbert flung himself wearily into the easy chair before the fire. He looked tired. It had not been an easy thing for him to tell Leslie, and the terror that had sprung into her eyes when the meaning of what he had told her came home to her was not a pleasant thing to remember. Now, when the die was cast, he was beset with doubts of his own wisdom. Anne looked at him remorsefully. Then she slipped down on the rug beside him and laid her glossy red head on his arm. "Gilbert, I've been rather hateful over this. I won't be any more. Please just call me red-headed and forgive me." By which Gilbert understood that no matter what came of it, there would be no I-told-you-sos. But he was not wholly comforted. Duty in the abstract is one thing. Duty in the concrete is quite another, especially when the doer is confronted by a woman's stricken eyes. Some instinct made Anne keep away from Leslie for the next 3 days. On the third evening Leslie came down to the little house and told Gilbert that she had made up her mind. She would take Dick to Montreal and have the operation. She was very pale and seemed to have wrapped herself in her old mantle of aloofness, but her eyes had lost the look which had haunted Gilbert. They were cold and bright, and she proceeded to discuss details with him in a crisp, businesslike way. There were plans to be made, and many things to be thought over. When Leslie had got the information she wanted, she went home. Anne wanted to walk part of the way with her. "Better not," said Leslie curtly. "Today's rain has made the ground damp. Good night." "Have I lost my friend?" said Anne with a sigh. "If the operation is successful and Dick Moore finds himself again, Leslie will retreat into some remote fastness of her soul where none of us can ever find her." "Perhaps she will leave him," said Gilbert. "Leslie would never do that, Gilbert. Her sense of duty is very strong. She told me once that her grandmother West always impressed upon her the fact that when she assumed any responsibility she must never shirk it, no matter what the consequences might be. That is one of her cardinal rules. I suppose it's very old-fashioned." "Don't be bitter, Anne girl. You know you don't think it old-fashioned. You know you have the very same idea of sacredness of assumed responsibilities yourself. And you are right. Shirking responsibilities is the curse of our modern life, the secret of all the unrest and discontent that is seething in the world." "Thus saith the preacher," mocked Anne. But under the mockery she felt that he was right, and she was very sick at heart for Leslie. A week later Miss Cornelia descended like an avalanche upon the little house. Gilbert was away, and Anne was compelled to bear the shock of the impact alone. Miss Cornelia hardly waited to get her hat off before she began. "Anne, do you mean to tell me it's true what I've heard, that Dr. Blythe has told Leslie Dick can be cured, and that she is going to take him to Montreal to have him operated on?" "Yes, it is quite true, Miss Cornelia," said Anne bravely. "Well, it's inhuman cruelty, that's what it is," said Miss Cornelia, violently agitated. "I did think Dr. Blythe was a decent man. I didn't think he could have been guilty of this." "Dr. Blythe thought it was his duty to tell Leslie that there was a chance for Dick," said Anne with spirit. "And," she added, loyalty to Gilbert getting the better of her, "I agree with him." "Oh, no, you don't, dearie," said Miss Cornelia. "No person with any bowels of compassion could." "Captain Jim does." "Don't quote that old ninny to me," cried Miss Cornelia, "and I don't care who agrees with him. Think what it means to that poor, hunted, harried girl." "We do think of it. But Gilbert believes that a doctor should put the welfare of a patient's mind and body before all other considerations." "That's just like a man. But I expected better things of you, Anne," said Miss Cornelia, more in sorrow than in wrath. Then she proceeded to bombard Anne with precisely the same arguments with which the latter had attacked Gilbert, and Anne valiantly defended her husband with the weapons he had used for his own protection. Long was the fray, but Miss Cornelia made an end at last. "It's an iniquitous shame," she declared almost in tears. "That's just what it is, an iniquitous shame. Poor, poor Leslie." "Don't you think Dick should be considered a little too?" pleaded Anne. "Dick? Dick Moore? He's happy enough. He's a better behaved and more reputable member of society now than he ever was before. Why, he was a drunkard and perhaps worse. Are you going to set him loose again to roar and to devour?" "He may reform," said poor Anne, beset by foe without and traitor within. "Reform your grandmother," retorted Miss Cornelia. "Dick Moore got the injuries that left him as he is in a drunken brawl. He deserves his fate. It was sent on him for a punishment. I don't believe the doctor has any business to tamper with the visitations of God." "Nobody knows how Dick was hurt, Miss Cornelia. It may not have been in a drunken brawl at all. He may have been waylaid and robbed." "Pigs may whistle, but they have poor mouths for it," said Miss Cornelia. "Well, the gist of what you tell me is that the thing is settled, and there's no use in talking. If that's so, I'll hold my tongue. I don't propose to wear my teeth out gnawing files. When a thing has to be, I give in to it. But I like to make mighty sure first that it has to be. Now I'll devote my energies to comforting and sustaining Leslie. And after all," added Miss Cornelia, brightening up hopefully, "perhaps nothing can be done for Dick." End of chapter 30.